My name is Angela Turner. I am 32 years old. And until that fateful Thursday evening, I lived under the firm belief that the heavy brass locks on my front and back doors were more than enough to keep my overbearing parents completely out of my life. I was devastatingly wrong. As I pulled my car into the driveway after a grueling day of work, the first thing that caught my eye was their silver sedan idling quietly at the curb. They did not wave at me, nor did they make any move to step out of the vehicle to greet me. Instead, they sat perfectly still, waiting in the dimming light until they were absolutely certain I had noticed the beautifully wrapped box sitting directly on my doorstep. The moment our eyes met through the glass, my father slowly shifted the car into drive and they slipped away into the evening traffic without a single sound. A small white card had been meticulously tied beneath the heavy satin ribbon, bearing 4 words written in my mother's unmistakable, elegant handwriting: "Don't make a scene." I should have left that box exactly where it was, untouched and ignored on the cold concrete, but the cold warning felt like yet another silent command from my suffocating childhood that I was conditioned to obey. I carried the surprisingly heavy box into my entryway, set it on the hallway table, and used a pair of kitchen shears to cut through the thick ribbon. The very first thing I saw when I lifted the lid was a high-quality photograph of my 8-year-old son, Nathan, sound asleep in his own bed in the room just upstairs. The second object was a shining, freshly cut duplicate key to our house. Beneath those 2 items sat a thick manila envelope stamped with the bold, official name of a notorious local family court attorney. My knees nearly gave out beneath me, and my breath caught in my throat as a wave of cold terror washed over me. I did not open the envelope. Instead, my hand shook so violently that I nearly dropped my phone as I dialed emergency services. Within 10 minutes, 2 police officers arrived at my doorstep, took one look at my pale face, immediately separated the contents of the box, and warned me in no uncertain terms not to touch a single thing. It was at that exact moment that the front door clicked open and my husband, Mark, walked into the hallway. He froze instantly at the sight of the dark blue uniforms, looked down at the open box on the table, and turned an ashen shade of white. He looked at me with hollow eyes and whispered a plea, begging me not to tell him that they had actually gone through with it. His quiet, terrified words frightened me far more than the photograph of my sleeping son because they carried a heavy, undeniable truth. My husband knew something terrible about my parents that he had deliberately kept hidden from me. Before I reveal what the responding officers found buried deeper beneath those legal papers, and why my husband looked as though a ghost had just stepped into our home, let me pause and ask you, what time is it where you are right now? From what corner of the world are you watching this unfold, and what is the weather like outside your window? I am deeply curious to see how far my story will travel, and how many of you will recognize the subtle, quiet signs of a family dynamic that turns deadly. My husband's name was Mark, and the very second those words escaped his lips, both of the responding officers turned their full attention toward him, their eyes narrowing. I stared at him too, my mind racing through 1,000 worst-case scenarios as the silence in the hallway grew suffocating. For several agonizing seconds, Mark seemed completely paralyzed, unable to decide whether to look me in the eyes or keep his gaze fixed on the open box sitting between us. Finally, his shaking hand rose to point at the thick manila envelope, and he asked the older officer if anyone had already removed the legal documents inside. The officer, whose name tag read Ramirez, shook his head calmly and said no. Mark swallowed hard, took a deep, unstable breath, and confessed that 3 weeks prior, my father, Frank, had approached him outside his downtown office. Frank had caught him just as he was leaving for lunch, speaking with a terrifyingly casual demeanor, almost as if he were discussing a routine business transaction or a standard insurance policy. He had handed Mark a document, calling it an emergency guardianship plan, claiming it was a necessary precaution in case Mark and I were ever hospitalized at the same time. Mark told us he had immediately refused and walked away, but I could only stare at my husband in absolute disbelief. He had never mentioned this encounter to me, not during dinner, not during our quiet evening walks, not once. Mark quickly tried to explain, his voice desperate as he pleaded for my understanding, saying that Frank had insisted my mother, Nancy, believed I had become emotionally unstable and that a responsible party needed to be legally prepared to step in for Nathan's sake. Mark had furiously told him to stay the hell away from our family, To which my father had simply smiled a cold, knowing smile and replied that Mark might not actually get to make that decision when the time came. Mark admitted he had kept the entire disturbing encounter a secret because he genuinely believed that telling me would reopen old, deep psychological wounds I had spent years of painful therapy trying to close. I wanted to scream at him, I wanted to be angry at his betrayal of my trust, but the physical reality of the box sitting on our table was proof that his protective silence had only given my parents more room to move in the shadows. Officer Ramirez, possessing the calm authority of a seasoned veteran, pulled on a pair of blue latex gloves and began to carefully excavate the remaining contents of the box. Beneath the family court envelope, his gloved hands retrieved a small digital recorder, a black flash drive, 6 glossy photographs, a child's wooden toy train, and a stuffed blue bear that I recognized with a sickening jolt in my stomach. The wooden train belonged to Nathan, a toy he played with almost daily, and the stuffed bear had mysteriously vanished from our home after our last, highly strained visit to my parents' house 4 months ago. As Ramirez lifted the bear from the box, a faint, familiar floral scent drifted upward into the close air of the entryway. It was my mother's signature perfume, the exact same heavy, sweet scent that used to linger silently in the hallway outside my bedroom door during my teenage years whenever she stood there in the dark, listening to my private conversations. For one sharp, terrifying instant, the present dissolved and I was 16 years old again, frantically hiding my college applications beneath my mattress because Nancy had already decided which local university she expected me to attend and what career I would pursue. That memory did not return to me as a gentle, distant scene, it came as a physical weight crushing my chest, the distinct auditory click of a brass doorknob turning, and her soft, patronizing voice asking why a daughter who truly loved her family would ever need to keep secrets from her mother. The photographs buried beneath the toys were infinitely worse than the perfume. The first one, which we had already seen, showed Nathan sleeping peacefully in his bed. The second image captured him eating breakfast at our kitchen island, looking completely unaware of any danger. A third photograph had been shot through the wooden slats of the privacy fence behind his elementary school. The small, yellow dates printed in the lower corners of the images revealed that this surveillance had been ongoing for nearly 2 entire months. In one particular image, the glare of the sun on our kitchen window had caught a partial reflection of the photographer's face. It was not my mother, and it was not my father. It was the face of a cold-eyed, middle-aged man whom neither Mark nor I had ever laid eyes on before. Officer Ramirez's entire demeanor shifted instantly. He stopped treating the situation as a petty, dramatic family dispute and immediately radioed for a supervisor and an evidence technician to be dispatched to our address. He then turned to us and asked a critical question: had my parents ever possessed a key to our current home? I explained that the previous year, Frank, who prided himself on his handiwork, had helped us replace the lock on our heavy back door after a storm damaged the frame. While we had taken the precaution of changing the front door locks after cutting off contact with them, it had never occurred to us to change the back door lock. Mark closed his eyes tightly, leaning his forehead against the wall, as the horrifying realization set in that my parents had possessed unfettered access to our sanctuary for months. When Ramirez carefully opened the legal envelope, he revealed a meticulously drafted petition addressed to the local family court, requesting that the state grant temporary, emergency custody of Nathan to my parents. While the main petition remained unsigned, several attached affidavits and witness statements had already been fully prepared and notarized. According to these documents, I was a deeply troubled mother who regularly missed her child's critical medical appointments, frequently left Nathan entirely unattended for hours, threatened violence against my own relatives, and suffered from unpredictable, hysterical emotional episodes that made our home environment active and dangerous. Not a single word of it was true. To my absolute horror, one of the supporting statements carried what appeared to be my husband's signature at the bottom of the page. Mark leaned over the table, his eyes wide with shock, and stated emphatically that the signature was a complete forgery. Another page appeared to be an official psychological evaluation from a licensed family therapist I had never even heard of, describing private sessions with me that had never actually occurred and concluding with a strong recommendation that Nathan be removed from my care immediately to prevent an avoidable tragedy. The legal language was polished, clinical, and utterly terrifying because it had been designed by an expert to sound incredibly reasonable to an outside judge. Officer Ramirez then picked up the small digital recorder, which Mark immediately recognized as a highly sensitive model. 2 months prior, Mark had discovered an identical black device slid deep beneath the passenger seat of his car. At the time, he had foolishly assumed it belonged to a coworker who frequently carpooled with him, but when he later asked, the coworker denied ever owning such a thing. Believing it was just a cheap toy, Mark had thrown it in the trash. This new recorder, however, featured a strip of industrial black adhesive on the back and a small label reading "Kitchen 2." Ramirez placed the device into a plastic evidence bag without turning it on, looking at us grimly as he noted that the label strongly suggested the existence of a kitchen 1 somewhere in our house. The temperature in our home seemed to drop instantly. The officers asked for our formal permission to conduct an immediate, basic protective sweep of our home to look for any obvious surveillance equipment while we waited for the forensics team. We agreed without hesitation. Within 15 minutes, they discovered a tiny, pinhole camera hidden deep inside the plastic housing of the smoke detector directly facing our kitchen table. Another identical device had been expertly fitted behind the metal air vent in the hallway just outside Nathan's bedroom. The camera in the kitchen was not connected to our home network. It saved footage locally to an internal microSD card, meaning that whoever had installed it had fully intended to return to our home to retrieve the data. The officers also pointed out faint, fresh scratches around the brass lock of our back door. I stood in the hallway, my mind spinning back to Nathan's school fundraiser 2 weeks ago, remembering how my mother had appeared out of nowhere, smiling warmly as if our estrangement were just a silly misunderstanding. She had held me in a tight, suffocating hug before I could pull away, and at the time, I thought she was simply trying to humiliate me in public. Now, the chilling truth was clear. She had kept us thoroughly distracted in public while my father used his duplicate key to enter our empty home and service the hidden cameras. The evidence technician spent over an hour photographing every square inch of our entryway and the hidden devices. Officer Ramirez warned us that while the forged signatures and court drafts were deeply concerning, they did not automatically prove who had created them, and family court documents could legally be drafted without ever being filed. However, he admitted that the combination of the duplicate key, the physical entry, and the active electronic surveillance painted an incredibly serious, criminal picture. He strongly advised us not to contact my parents, not to post a single word on social media, and to keep this discovery entirely private. He then asked if we had a safe place to stay for the night. Mark's sister lived just across the bay, but the thought of packing up and fleeing felt like we were completely surrendering our home to the monsters outside. Ultimately, the fear for our safety won, and I packed a single duffel bag for Nathan and another for us. Nathan was still at his friend's birthday dinner, and Mark quietly arranged for his sister to pick him up directly from the party, refusing to explain the terrifying details over the phone. Just before we walked out the front door, Ramirez handed me a property receipt for the seized evidence and asked if my parents knew my husband would be working late that night. I nodded, remembering that Nancy had called Mark's assistant that morning under the pretense of confirming a non-existent dinner invitation. Ramirez looked at the placement of the box on the step, then back at our open door, and whispered that they had likely expected me to open the box completely alone. I finally understood the true, sinister message hidden beneath the satin ribbon. "Don't make a scene" was not a plea for peace, it was a cold, calculated order to suffer in complete silence, isolated from anyone who could save me. As we stepped out into the cold night air, the forensic technician emerged from our hallway, holding a third plastic evidence bag. Inside was a dusty memory card, labeled with my name and a date from 6 years ago, the exact week my son, Nathan, was born. We spent that agonizing night at Mark's sister's house, but sleep was a luxury that refused to visit me. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway, every rattle of the wind against the window panes, made my chest tighten with the terrifying image of a key turning slowly in our back door. We had lied to Nathan, telling him that an unexpected plumbing emergency had forced us out of our home for the night. Being the sweet, trusting boy he is, he accepted the explanation without question, curled up on the guest room couch with his favorite blanket, and quietly asked if his grandparents knew where we were staying. The question was entirely innocent, yet it struck me like a physical blow. It was a devastating reminder of how deeply and systematically Nancy had inserted herself into his innocent world, making him feel as though her constant presence was a natural law of his existence. I gently told him that they did not know where we were, then sat beside him in the dark, stroking his hair until his breathing finally became slow, deep, and even. Across the dim room, Mark watched me, the heavy burden of guilt written in the deep lines of his face. Once we were absolutely certain Nathan was asleep, Mark approached me with tears in his eyes, apologizing profusely for keeping Frank's approach a secret from me. I told him that while I was deeply hurt by his silence, I also understood why he had hesitated to tell me. My parents were masters of manipulation. They had spent decades training everyone in their orbit to manage my emotional reactions instead of ever confronting their own monstrous behavior. But as I looked at my sleeping son, a cold resolve settled over me. That pattern of silence, of protecting them from the consequences of their actions, ended that night. The next morning, the harsh glare of the sun brought no relief, only a summons. Officer Ramirez called us back to the police station. The dusty memory card they had recovered from our hallway vent, the one labeled with the week of Nathan's birth, had not been recorded by any device currently active in our home. Instead, it was an archive. It contained meticulously scanned documents, covertly recorded voice files, and candid photographs collected over a span of 6 agonizing years. The earliest audio recording was a conversation between Nancy and me in my hospital room, just hours after I had given birth to Nathan. I remembered the conversation vividly, but I had never known, not even for a second, that she was recording it. On the tape, Nancy's voice sounded incredibly gentle, dripping with maternal concern as she urged me to sign a temporary medical authorization form, capitalizing on my absolute physical and mental exhaustion after a grueling labor. I had refused her back then, clinging to some instinct of self-preservation. But the recording did not end when I stopped speaking. On the tape, after I had left the hospital room to walk down the hall, my father Frank's cold, calculating voice appeared. He had muttered to my mother that I would eventually come around once I realized just how little control I actually had over my own life. Hearing those words spoken in the quiet privacy of a hospital room 6 years later felt like discovering a trapdoor beneath a floor I had walked on my entire life. The memory card also contained digital copies of our tax returns, Mark's detailed work calendars, Nathan's school schedule, and extensive typed notes about completely private arguments Mark and I had behind closed doors. Most of these notes were ordinary, mundane details of a normal marriage, twisted into horrific accusations of instability. A cancelled dentist appointment was labeled as systematic medical neglect. A babysitter arriving 10 minutes late was documented as leaving a child entirely unsupervised. A single photograph of me holding a glass of wine at a family holiday dinner was catalogued under a folder labeled substance abuse concerns. My parents had never been documenting actual danger to their grandson. They had been meticulously manufacturing a narrative of my unfitness. Officer Ramirez introduced us to Detective Lena Cho, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who specialized in stalking and high-tech electronic surveillance cases. She was careful not to promise us an immediate arrest, explaining with professional detachment that digital files required extensive forensic authentication and that the physical tracking devices had to be traced directly to a buyer. She also warned us, with a grim look, that Frank had already caught wind of the police involvement and had called the department. He had claimed that the box left on our doorstep was merely a harmless family archive delivered during a petty domestic disagreement, and he had actively accused me of overreacting due to my long-standing, severe emotional problems. He had even smugly dropped the name of a retired police captain, claiming this officer would gladly vouch for his standing as an honorable, outstanding member of the community. The move was so incredibly predictable that it actually had a bizarrely calming effect on me. He had not called to ask if his daughter or grandson were safe. His very first instinct was to assume control of the official narrative and protect his own reputation. Detective Cho saw right through his tactics. She strongly recommended that we immediately change every lock on our home, issue a high-priority security alert to Nathan's school, and file for a temporary civil restraining order to establish a legal boundary. Our family attorney, Melissa Grant, met us at her office that afternoon to review the paperwork. She carefully went through the forged guardianship petition and immediately noticed a critical detail that the rest of us had missed in our panic. The state licensing number on the therapist's letterhead belonged to a real, practicing professional, but the name printed at the top of the letter did not match the state registry at all. Furthermore, the official notary stamp on Mark's forged signature page was genuine, but a quick search revealed it had been reported stolen from a local shipping office 3 months earlier. My parents had built this entire legal trap out of stolen pieces of real identities, foolishly hoping that a busy family court judge would never inspect the documents closely enough to notice the discrepancies. Melissa advised us in the strongest terms not to attempt to visit or confront my parents under any circumstances. Instead, she drafted a formal, legally binding cease and desist notice, ordering them to immediately stop contacting us, to stay away from Nathan's school, to never step foot on our property again, and to immediately cease using our personal records. Mark wanted to dispatch a process server to hand-deliver it immediately, but I found myself needing a moment of quiet. I asked for 10 minutes alone in the law firm's cold, quiet conference room. Standing by the window, staring down at the busy city streets below, I found myself transported back to when I was 22 years old, standing in my parents' pristine kitchen with a physical acceptance letter to a prestigious graduate program in another state. Frank had slowly taken the letter from my hands, folded it twice with clinical precision, and stated coldly that the family had already invested far too much money in my little academic experiments. Nancy had wept hysterically, accusing me of abandoning them, until I finally broke down and agreed to stay in San Francisco. For years after that day, I had falsely described that choice to my friends as my own independent decision, because admitting the humiliating truth of my parents' control felt far too painful to bear. Now, 10 years later, those exact same people were trying to turn my independent adulthood into another legal document they could rewrite and control. The realization washed over me with a sudden, burning anger. I walked back into the main room, picked up the pen, and signed the notice. That very evening, Detective Cho called us with the first major break in the criminal investigation. A unique serial number recovered from the electronic components of the hallway camera had led investigators directly to a local, high-end security system installer. The buyer had paid for the equipment in cash to avoid a paper trail, but the store's high-definition security footage captured the transaction with absolute clarity. The man buying the camera was the exact same unknown individual whose face had been caught in the window reflection at Nathan's school. His name was Calvin Rhee, a disgraced former police officer turned private investigator whose license had recently been suspended following multiple complaints of illegal GPS tracking and harassment. Emergency phone records obtained through a rapid preservation request showed dozens of calls between Rhee and a cell phone registered directly to Frank's consulting business. Detective Cho cautioned us not to celebrate just yet, noting that phone contact alone did not definitively prove a criminal conspiracy, and a clever defense attorney could easily argue that Rhee had been hired solely for lawful, third-party observation. Then, her voice dropped slightly as she delivered the final piece of news. Officers had attempted to visit Rhee's listed business address earlier that afternoon, only to find the office completely abandoned. He had cleared out his files and fled into the night. An hour after that chilling phone call, my phone buzzed. It was a voice message from my mother. Her voice was warm, dripping with a sickeningly sweet maternal tone, completely ignoring the existence of the police, the box, or the legal notices we had drafted. She claimed she had heard a rumor that Nathan might be missing school due to stress, and she warmly offered to come collect him for a few days until things settled down between us. But at the very end of the message, her warm tone vanished, replaced by a low, freezing whisper that sent shivers down my spine. She told me that a judge would care deeply about stability, and that I should think very carefully before I made myself look completely unstable in public. I did not reply. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I did not hear my mother as an all-powerful, terrifying figure who held my destiny in her hands. I heard her for exactly what she was, a desperate, fading woman desperately clinging to a failing script. I immediately forwarded the audio file to Detective Cho. But before the police could act, Melissa called us with urgent news from the courthouse. The fake emergency guardianship petition was no longer just a terrifying draft sitting in a box on our table. Someone had just attempted to officially file it at the county courthouse. The attempted filing forced our private nightmare entirely into the open, stripping away any lingering illusions of safety. Melissa immediately obtained a certified copy of the filing from the clerk's office and discovered that Frank and Nancy were aggressively pushing for an ex parte emergency order, a ruling a judge could make immediately, before Mark and I could even be formally notified or allowed to speak in court. In their petition, my parents had painted a picture of absolute chaos, claiming that my husband and I had abruptly vanished with Nathan following a severe, violent domestic crisis. They asserted that the local police had already visited our home because of my irrational, hysterical behavior, and they presented themselves as the only stable, responsible relatives capable of providing immediate care for our son. They had seamlessly transformed our desperate call for emergency help into the primary evidence of my unfitness. Attached to the petition were the forged therapist's letter, the statement bearing the expertly copied version of Mark's signature, a series of cropped and manipulated photographs, and a formal declaration from Calvin Rhee, who described himself simply as a certified family safety consultant. The petition requested immediate, temporary guardianship, full access to Nathan's school records, and a court order granting them legal possession of our house keys. Recognizing the extreme urgency, Melissa filed an emergency opposition before the assigned family law judge could review their fraudulent request. Because the petition alleged an immediate, severe risk to a child, the court scheduled an emergency hearing for the very next afternoon. Detective Cho could not officially tell the judge what conclusions the active criminal investigation would ultimately reach, but she provided a formal police declaration confirming that hidden cameras, a duplicate key, and suspected forged documents had been seized from our home. Furthermore, Officer Ramirez's body camera timestamps proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the police had responded to evidence of a crime that we had reported, not to a domestic disturbance caused by my behavior. My parents arrived at the courthouse dressed as if they were attending a high society charity luncheon. Nancy wore a soft, pale blue suit and carried a leather folder tightly against her chest, looking the picture of a concerned, elegant grandmother. Frank stood confidently in the hallway, greeting two prominent local attorneys and nodding warmly to a court clerk who seemed to recognize him from his years on various community boards. When his eyes finally met mine, he did not look ashamed, nor did he show a single flicker of fear. He simply looked deeply disappointed, wearing the exact same cold, judgmental expression he had worn whenever I brought home a school grade he considered beneath his impossible standards. Nancy took one deliberate step toward Nathan, who was waiting quietly with Mark's sister further down the corridor, but a uniformed court officer immediately stepped into her path, citing our formal temporary no-contact request. For one brief second, my mother's carefully constructed mask slipped. The maternal sweetness vanished from her eyes, and something incredibly cold, sharp, and hateful appeared beneath it before she quickly smoothed her features and walked into the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, their expensive attorney spoke with practiced ease, describing my parents as deeply devoted, desperate grandparents who were simply responding to alarming, credible information regarding their grandson's safety. He dismissed the box as a clumsy, well-intentioned attempt to share sentimental family records, and argued that the surveillance photographs had been taken solely to document Nathan's daily routine because my parents genuinely feared he was suffering from parental neglect. He portrayed the duplicate house key as an old spare that had been accidentally mixed in with returned belongings. Every boundary violation was recharacterized as loving concern, every outright lie was painted as a tragic misunderstanding. But then, Melissa stood up. With calm, lethal precision, she placed the original photographs we had recovered next to the heavily cropped versions my parents had attached to their petition. The original images featured wider backgrounds and clear, embedded date stamps that told a completely different story. One image, which my parents had labeled as evidence of Nathan wandering unsupervised and vulnerable outside his school, revealed when uncropped that Mark was standing only a few feet away, holding his hand. Another image, labeled as proof of my severe intoxication at a family gathering, actually showed a wider room of 6 other laughing adults holding identical glasses during a brief, celebratory birthday toast. The judge's expression hardened as he stared at the visual evidence of manipulation, and he sternly asked my parents' attorney why these images had been deliberately altered. The attorney, visibly caught off guard, stammered and requested a brief recess to consult with his clients. Frank leaned over to whisper urgently to him, but Nancy, unable to contain herself, suddenly stood up and interrupted the proceedings. Ignoring her attorney's frantic gestures, she insisted to the judge that she could explain everything. The judge ordered her to remain silent and sit down unless formally called to testify, yet Nancy kept talking, her voice rising in pitch. She declared that I had always been an incredibly impulsive, fragile child, that my husband Mark was weak and easily manipulated, and that someone of sound mind had to plan for Nathan's future before it was too late. She insisted that the family could not simply sit back and wait for my inevitable collapse. Seizing the moment, Melissa asked Nancy directly whether she had authorized anyone to enter our private home. My parents' attorney objected furiously, but the judge overruled him, allowing a limited answer since the petition actively requested physical access to our property. Nancy looked directly across the courtroom at me, her eyes burning with a terrifying conviction, and said that a mother does whatever is necessary when her daughter refuses to accept help. It was not a complete legal confession, but it was more than enough to completely shatter the image of the gentle, concerned grandmother she had tried so hard to project. Frank grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her back into her seat and telling her to shut up, but the damage was done. The judge noted the interaction, as did the court reporter, whose fingers flew across the machine. Melissa then presented the audio file of the voicemail Nancy had sent me, in which she warned that a judge would care about stability. Because Nancy had sent the message directly to my phone, there was no issue of recording consent. The judge listened to the audio twice in dead silence. After the second playback, he denied the emergency guardianship request with prejudice, issued a strict temporary protective order prohibiting my parents from contacting Nathan or approaching his school, and formally referred the suspicious, forged documents to the court's specialized fraud unit. He also ordered that no future petition from Frank or Nancy be considered by the county court without prior, formal notice and a scheduled hearing. Outside the courtroom, the elegant facade collapsed completely. Frank finally lost his carefully maintained composure, stepping so close to me in the hallway that a court officer had to physically move between us. He hissed that I had absolutely no idea what I had just started, warning me that people in this city knew who he was and exactly what kind of ungrateful, troubled daughter I had always been. For most of my life, a sentence like that, delivered with that specific tone of parental authority, would have silenced me instantly, sending me retreating into a corner of self-doubt. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye and told him to let them see the evidence. Nancy began to cry hysterically, but as I watched her, I realized there were no actual tears wetting her cheeks, it was just another performance. She turned to Mark, accusing him of allowing me to ruin Nathan's relationship with the grandparents who loved him. Mark looked at her with a calm, steady resolve I had never seen in him before and replied that they had ruined that relationship themselves the very moment they used a stolen key to enter our home. Frank's face tightened with rage as he spat that we could never actually prove who had entered our house. From behind him, Detective Cho, who had been quietly waiting near the elevators, spoke up. She calmly stated that her team was actively working on proving exactly that. Frank turned around, his eyes landing on her gold police badge, and for the very first time, the absolute confidence drained completely from his face. Cho calmly asked both of my parents to accompany her to the police station for voluntary questioning. Their rattled attorney immediately refused on their behalf, grabbing their arms and hurrying them toward the descending elevator. As the metal doors began to slide shut, Nancy stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. The doors closed, but not before she lifted her phone and began frantically typing. Less than 5 minutes later, while we were still waiting for our elevator, my phone began to buzz repeatedly. Every single member of our extended family had just received a lengthy, frantic group text from my mother, claiming that I had suffered a massive mental breakdown, manipulated the local police, and tried to have my loving, innocent parents arrested. But in her blind, panicked rush to control the family narrative, Nancy had made a fatal mistake. She had attached the wrong file to the group message. Beneath her long paragraph of accusations was a crystal-clear photograph of our kitchen, taken from a high, down-angled perspective. Nancy had tried frantically to delete the message from the family group chat, but the digital damage was already done. Too many people had already viewed and downloaded the file. My cousin sent me a screenshot of the message before I even reached the first level of the parking garage. The image showed our kitchen from the exact angle of the pinhole camera hidden inside the smoke detector, looking down at the table where we ate our meals. In the lower corner, a digital timestamp placed the photograph 3 weeks before the box had ever appeared on my doorstep. In her panic, Nancy had directly connected herself to the very surveillance evidence she had insisted was a complete misunderstanding. Detective Cho acted immediately, contacting every recipient on the family thread and instructing them to preserve the original message with its metadata intact. By that evening, the court's fraud investigator, the district attorney's office, and the police cyber unit were all examining the exact same file. The embedded data showed that the kitchen photograph had been exported from a hidden folder named Angela Home Monitoring. The digital device history linked that folder directly to a laptop registered to Frank's private consulting company. Frank could still try to argue that some unknown third party had accessed his computer, but the protective wall they had built around themselves had begun to crack. The next morning, officers executed search warrants at my parents' suburban house and Frank's downtown office. Detective Cho later shared only what the strict limits of the law allowed. They recovered physical copies of our house key invoices from Calvin Rhee, a stolen notary seal, advanced surveillance equipment, and several thick binders labeled with dates stretching back into my childhood. One binder contained detailed reports on Mark's job, our neighbors, Nathan's teachers, and members of my extended family who might support or oppose my parents. Another binder contained drafts of anonymous, highly damaging complaints prepared for Nathan's school, Mark's employer, and the state child welfare authorities. The complaints had not all been sent, but they proved a highly coordinated plan: isolate us from our support systems, systematically damage our professional credibility, and then present my parents to the state as the only viable solution for Nathan. Calvin Rhee was located 2 days later, hiding out at a cheap motel just outside Sacramento. Faced with federal and state records tying him directly to the cameras and photographs, he quickly agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. He admitted that Frank had paid him tens of thousands of dollars to observe our home and install wireless recording devices. He also admitted that Nancy had provided our family schedules and deliberately distracted us during the school fundraiser. Rhee claimed he had never agreed to enter Nathan's bedroom, but digital forensics placed one of his tracking devices there. His desperate attempt to protect himself only supplied investigators with more incriminating details. My parents were formally arrested the following week. Frank faced severe criminal allegations involving residential burglary, stalking, conspiracy, forgery, identity misuse, and illegal electronic surveillance. Nancy faced many of the same charges, along with attempted fraud on the court. Their defense attorney immediately released a polished statement calling the arrests an unfortunate criminalization of a private, sensitive family disagreement. That statement lasted less than a day before local investigative reporters obtained copies of the court order and portions of the public filing. The social consequences came with devastating speed. Frank was placed on immediate leave from the prestigious nonprofit board he had chaired for 12 years. And 2 local organizations promptly removed his name from upcoming high-profile fundraisers. Nancy's church committee quietly asked her to step aside while the criminal case was pending. Friends who had previously accepted her version of events began forwarding us old messages in which she had asked highly suspicious, probing questions about our weekly schedule, our marriage, and Nathan's school. Each forwarded message became another clear thread in the horrifying pattern. I did not celebrate their public humiliation. I was far too busy trying to understand the terrifying scope of what they had built around my life. Melissa helped us file a comprehensive civil lawsuit for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, trespass, and the massive costs related to securing our home. We replaced every single lock, camera, computer, and phone. Mark changed his daily work routines, and Nathan's school added photographs of my parents to its restricted contact file. The expenses were enormous, but for the first time in my life, every step we took created actual physical distance instead of constant, lingering fear. Nancy was released on bail before trial under incredibly strict conditions, ordered not to contact us directly or indirectly. Frank had to surrender his passport and was barred from accessing any of his company's digital devices. Through distant relatives, they continued to send messages insisting they had only acted out of deep parental love. I gave the exact same response each time: love does not require forged signatures, hidden cameras, or a stolen key. 3 weeks later, a beautiful floral arrangement arrived at Mark's sister's house, where we were staying temporarily. There was no sender's name on the card, which read simply, "Families Forgive." Detective Cho traced the purchase to a prepaid debit card, but the store's security footage showed Nancy standing at the register, buying the flowers herself. It was a deliberate, direct violation of her court-ordered no-contact restriction. Cho arrested her again that very afternoon, revoking her bail. As Nancy was led from the courthouse in handcuffs after her release was officially revoked, she saw me standing across the lobby. She did not plead, and she did not pretend to cry. Instead, she stared directly into my eyes and silently mouthed 4 words: "You did this to us." I stood there and finally understood the profound difference between guilt and responsibility. I had not done this to them. I had simply stopped preventing the consequences of their own choices. The criminal case took 9 exhausting months to reach its final stage, and during that time, my parents used every legal delay and loophole available to them. Frank changed his defense attorneys twice, while Nancy requested multiple medical accommodations, only to appear at various social events telling people that the stressful charges were destroying her fragile health. Their remaining supporters sent character letters to the court, describing them as generous, respectable community members who had devoted their lives to their family. The prosecutor answered those letters by displaying large photographs of the hidden devices, financial records of their payments to the forged documents, and Nancy's own self-incriminating text message containing the kitchen camera image. The binders seized from their home revealed something even more deeply personal. For years, Frank had kept copies of private mail addressed to me. Among those papers was the original acceptance packet from the out-of-state graduate program I thought had rejected me. A second letter showed that the program had actually offered me a full financial aid package after I had supposedly asked to defer my admission. I had never seen either letter. Nancy had called the admissions office pretending to be me, withdrawing my application permanently. Another folder contained private emails Frank had sent to a former college boyfriend, warning him that I was severely unstable and would ruin his professional career. My parents had not begun their campaign of control when Nathan was born. They had simply expanded a system of total surveillance that had worked for most of my young life. Melissa asked whether I wanted these historical details included in our civil case, and I said yes. I did not do it because a court could return the life opportunities they had stolen from me, but because I was completely finished helping them preserve a false family history. Mark read every single recovered document with me, sitting at our dining room table late into the night. Sometimes I became incredibly angry, sometimes I felt absolutely nothing at all. The hardest moments were the ones in which I recognized my own old, self-critical words repeated back to me in Nancy's letters, the belief that I was too sensitive, too impulsive, and too dependent to make major decisions on my own. I had spent years speaking about myself in my mother's harsh, critical language. Nathan knew only what was appropriate for his age. We told him his grandparents had broken very serious laws, that responsible adults were handling this situation, and that none of it was his fault. He asked if they loved him, and I told him I believed they felt something they called love, but love without respect could easily become possession. He was quiet for a long moment, then said he did not want anyone taking pictures through his window ever again. That simple, heartbreaking sentence became a key part of the victim impact statement Melissa helped us prepare for the court. As the trial date approached, Calvin agreed to testify fully. The forensic evidence showed that his surveillance equipment had entered our house multiple times, and phone location records placed Frank nearby during 2 of those illegal entries, while Nancy's messages proved she had coordinated our distractions. The forged therapist letter was traced to a template found directly on Frank's computer, and Mark's copied signature had been lifted from an old contractor agreement. The stolen notary seal was recovered from a locked drawer in Nancy's sewing room. Faced with this overwhelming wall of physical evidence, both of my parents finally accepted plea agreements. Frank pleaded guilty to residential burglary, stalking, conspiracy, and forgery. Nancy pleaded guilty to stalking, conspiracy, attempted court fraud, and violating her protective order. At sentencing, Frank stood before the bench and asked the judge to consider his decades of service to the community. The judge replied coldly that public trust made his calculated abuse of power more serious, not less. Frank received a multi-year prison sentence to be followed by strict supervised release. Nancy received county custody, intensive probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and a lifetime protective order forbidding any contact with our family. The court also ordered full restitution for our extensive security costs and legal expenses. Their wealthy financial image collapsed entirely with the case. Frank's consulting company lost its major clients and closed, and their civil insurer refused to cover damages resulting from intentional criminal misconduct. To satisfy their legal fees, court restitution, and the final settlement of our civil claims, they were forced to sell the large, historic house where I had grown up. The nonprofit board removed Frank's name permanently and issued a public apology to their donors, and Nancy lost the social circle she had spent her life using as an audience. On the final day of sentencing, as she was being led away, she turned toward me and whispered, "Was it worth destroying everything?" I answered her quietly, "I didn't destroy it. I opened the box." That was the last direct conversation we ever had. A year after the sentencing, our house no longer felt like a place under constant observation. The back door has been entirely replaced, the hallway air vent repaired, and the kitchen smoke detector changed twice before I finally stopped looking up at it whenever I entered the room. Healing did not arrive as one dramatic, triumphant moment. It appeared slowly in ordinary, everyday things, leaving my phone on the counter without checking for messages, watching Nathan walk safely into school without scanning the parking lot for silver sedans, and having a normal disagreement with Mark without hearing my father's voice predicting our marriage would fail. Mark and I also repaired the silence between us. He promised never again to protect me by withholding painful information, and I promised to tell him whenever my old fears were shaping a new decision. We attended family counseling, not because my parents' forged letter had been right, but because real support is chosen, honest, and accountable. That distinction mattered deeply to me. Nancy had used the idea of mental health as a weapon to isolate me, and I refused to let her legacy turn asking for help into something shameful. The civil settlement paid our remaining security expenses and created an education fund for Nathan. I did not want money from my parents to feel like a reward, so we treated it purely as a restoration of what had been taken. Part of the settlement also required them to surrender every single photograph, voice recording, duplicate key, and document connected to us. Detective Cho supervised the physical transfer, which filled 12 boxes. I did not open most of them. Melissa arranged for a professional digital forensics company to identify anything necessary for our legal records and destroy the rest. One small envelope was returned to me because it contained my original graduate school acceptance letter. I held the yellowed paper for a long time, looking at my name. At 33, I applied to a local graduate program in the same field, and when the acceptance email arrived, I read it aloud to Mark and Nathan. No one took it from my hands. Our extended family reacted in different ways. Some apologized for believing Nancy, while others said they wanted to remain neutral, as though hidden cameras and forged court documents were merely two sides of a disagreement. I stopped arguing with them. Neutrality had always been the quiet space in which my parents operated best, and anyone who required me to minimize the truth in order to keep family peace no longer had a central place in my life. Nathan eventually asked if he would ever see his grandparents again. I told him the protective order would remain, and that when he was older, he could discuss his feelings with us and qualified professionals. I did not ask him to hate them, because hatred would have kept them present in our lives in a different form. I simply wanted him to understand boundaries, evidence, and the difference between forgiveness and access. Forgiveness can be personal and quiet, but access to our lives must be earned. Sometimes people call what happened revenge, but I understand it differently. It was simply the moment the scene ended, and the truth began.